excited. Okay, today we have a special guest also for our course. This is Professor Danny Wong from the University of Malaya. I think perhaps some of you already know him. It's very popular. And especially those coming from the University of Malaya, two students from Malaya. You know him?
No, I just...
Oh my God! It's very famous now. Okay, thank you, Professor Danny, for coming for the course. And you have 60 minutes to present your lecture, and then we continue with the discussion. Okay.
Very good morning to everyone. Thank you, Prof. Mada, for the kind introduction. Definitely not popular. Yeah. I'd like to thank University Gadjah Mada for inviting me to this very exciting program. And I didn't know that this has been going on for the past 6 years now. So this is definitely a very meaningful gathering of people that not just to learn, but also to appreciate each other's presence and to start to make friends that will last you for the rest of your life, I suppose. Yeah. So my topic is this: Chinese in Southeast Asia in a transnational context. So I'm a historian by training, so you will find that I'm very descriptive and narrative. So in any case, this topic is something, I don't know how many of you are interested in a topic like this, because Chinese in Southeast Asia is definitely a long-term feature in Southeast Asian history, in Southeast Asian studies as well. So you can see that this is a very, well, to some people it's important, to some others you may say, yeah, there's another group of people in Southeast Asia, because in Southeast Asia you have so many different types of people, and what's so special about this group? But let us start by going through a bit of what we understand, or what I try to understand about transnational Chinese, or Chinese in a transnational context. Because I must remind each and every one of us here that most of us historians started life working on one single country. We are all historians of nation state to some extent. So therefore, some people work on Indonesia. I started off life as a historian working on Vietnam. That was my original training on Vietnamese history. And then later on, I started to move away, in a way, started to get interested with the Chinese and so on. And therefore, spending more time working on Chinese and on China's relations with Southeast Asia and so on. So therefore, the idea of transnational Chinese is also very new to me. So we are learning together. So it's not so much of a lecture, but telling you something to share with you the experience of the Chinese in Southeast Asia. The word that I would use constantly is the experience of the Chinese in Southeast Asia. So in the process of doing that, we'll try to understand, or try to find, or try to glean where about is this transnational element. Professor Vincent have gone through with you a lot of theories and ideas about transnationalism and so on. I am a beginner in the sense, trying to learn as much as possible about transnational idea of transnationalism, as well as transnational history, and at the same time to try to put that in the context of the Chinese as well. So we are learning together. As we go along, you will find some element of it perhaps, and perhaps others may not be. So let us start by looking at this. This is the outline. Oh, do I need to do that all the time? Oh, okay, yeah. So, Yeah, otherwise I would have to run here and then. Yeah. Anyway, this is the outline. I'm going to give a brief understanding of introduction of what transnational history to my understanding, and to put it in the context of the Chinese in Southeast Asia. And then after that, it will be a long one, very long lecture on Chinese experience in Southeast Asia. Chinese experience, what did they go through throughout this 100 over years or 200 years and so on. And in between, we will try to look at some elements of transnational history. And then finally, the part 3 is, there are 4 themes that I also identified, which I hope maybe some of you in future, if you are going to do some postgraduate studies or in your own research, if you want to explore some of these themes. Now, from what I have read, from what I have gleaned through some of the literature, transnational history to me is this: recovering history from, among others, especially the nation, the constraint of nation state. I started by saying that we are all historians of nation states. I work on Vietnam, now I work on Malaysia, and things like that. But we are trying to go beyond that, because by confining ourselves to just looking at the nation state, I think we will be missing a lot of points. We will be missing a lot of very important in trying to understand some aspects of this history. So if we were to look at the Chinese in Southeast Asia by just looking into the Chinese in Malaysia, of which you're looking at one of them, your perspective would be very much confined by the boundaries set about by the state, the nation state. So when you look at Danny Wong, you say, that's the Chinese in Southeast Asia. Yes, yes, but somehow that perspective is also only confined to the perspective of his Malaysian experience. We can't look at things like that. So the argument is that we should go beyond that. We should we should transcend boundaries. So therefore, to recover history from the nation states. That's point number 1, from my understanding. Number 2, if you look into some of the studies on transnational history, I like some books like talking about history of products like tea, history of cod fish. If you go to UK, fish and chips. Have you ever eaten fish and chips? Yeah? Fish and chips in Malaysia is always not good. Why? Because the cook or the shops always give you dory fish. You know dory fish? The cheapest of all the sea fish, right? It has a peculiar smell in it. It's something like it came from the earth. Ada bau tanah in a sense, right? So you find that it's not very nice. But if you are in UK, in London, and then you say, I want fish and chips, so they ask you, what type of fish would you like? So you say cod fish, C-O-D cod, which is the white color fish from the deep sea of the Northern Sea. Beautiful, nice, right? So that cod fish has a history as well. So people have written books about it, and how it was caught in that area, how it actually went through different places, went through different process of how to treat it, and finally arrive on your plate as cod, as fish and chips. And we in Southeast Asia had no such privilege, because by the time it arrived in Southeast Asia, the cod fish would have cost a fortune. You have to pay a lot of money to get to eat a cod fish and chips. You can, but it's very expensive. So therefore, that experience of ideas, products passing through from one place to another would have been very important. So in that sense, those ideas that came from elsewhere being absorbed, and then after that integrated into our life, into our minds and so on, or if it is a product, into our daily use, daily consumption, would be something, on one hand, that we share. Everyone knows what is a cod fish now, right? Fish and chips, you would know. So this is something that we can share. So when I say something, you can understand, you can laugh at it as well, because we can understand, we have a mutual understanding of this thing. So this is a flow of idea that went through different times, different places, and finally arrive in your mind or in the things that you're using in your life. So therefore, products went through a series of processes and also transportations and so on, finally arrive at your place. And you use it differently, or perhaps you use it the same, just as another person coming from China, Taiwan, Japan, and so on. You all understand, we all use the same thing. When you hold a mic, you don't use a mic to hit people. Right? You don't use a mic to hit people, you know that this is a mic to speak something into, to project your voice. Right? So this is something that we can share together. Every one of us would understand certain ideas, certain things. Just like I always tell my students, in the 13th century, people in Southeast Asia watch Ramayana. Correct? You think about it, in Indianized and Hinduized Southeast Asia, everyone watch Ramayana. But maybe the experience will be slightly different. Maybe in Java, they will listen to the dialogue in Javanese language, or in a Mataram language, I don't know what else. But in Jampa, they would learn about Ramayana in the Cham language, for instance. So you have something common. You all know bumblebee? So if the bumblebee, you don't know bumblebee, that's scary. Bumblebee, you know the bumblebee? The yellow color thing that turns into a car, that when you transform, it becomes a transformer. Right? So this, guys, is something that you can understand. All of you coming from different countries, right? You are from Indonesia, some from Malaysia, from Japan. But when I mentioned bumblebee, except for you for a while, the rest understood. Right? Why? Because you have watched Transformer. So we have shared commonalities and so on. But at the same time, we would have something different. So the distinctions between boundaries would have been blurred and obsolete in that sense. Right? But so we have something common, we share something common. But at the same time, we are also looking at the end result of it, which is something that you process through. You would have some new understanding, new way of doing it at the different places and different times. For instance, the idea of hybridity. You would have something, the end product would be different. It's a mix between the original and the end product because it went through a series of processes and absorbed it in your mind and integrated into your daily life or into the society and so on. So hybridity is something that always emerges at the end of this transnational process. So far so good? Boleh? Bisa? Boleh. Okay. What about the Chinese then? We just talked about transnational history. So this is Chinese in Southeast Asia. I was looking at it, after I got this invitation, I was thinking about it because I'm currently based in China for a few months. And I was looking at it, this topic, and I was looking at my surrounding area. I was looking back into Chinese history. Then I realized that transnational history is not something that you will get to see or understand if you live too long in China today, right? I'm not sure that is correct, but I have such feeling that if I am a Chinese living in Beijing, I would not have this notion about the rest of the world. Right? Why? Because I am confined in the nation state of China, this great revived China. But what about the past? Well, you must remember China has been almost united for 20 centuries, not 1 century, 20 centuries. So the idea of being one China has blurred out almost everything else. Right? What about the former countries before China was united? During the warring states, during the spring and autumn period and so on? Well, maybe some of these boundaries still around because they became part of the provincial division and so on. But maybe you can have a trans-provincial history, but not transnational history. Having said that, the Chinese who moved away from China, Chinese overseas, especially those in Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asians were the earliest group that actually received this Chinese overseas. These possibilities was made possible if they moved out of China, right? That's one. But again, when they move out of China, they experience a lot of things that may be considered transnational. But again, that's not quite true on the other hand, because they also face other type of constraints. Because the moment they arrive in Southeast Asia, they belong to part and parcel of one colonial empire or another. So they may end up in Indochina. That's French Indochina. So they may be in Laos, and then, but still the culture, the boundaries that were set would be French, Francophone culture and so on. So they would go through that process. They wouldn't understand the people who lived in British Malaya because that's another empire, British Empire, or the Dutch Indies. When they come to Dutch Indies, they say, oh, this is a very strange place, right? They use a lot of different words, they use a lot of different experience. So, not exactly 100% transnational. The boundaries of the empire still cut off a lot of things. But at the same time, you also find that later on, when the empires disintegrated, it turned into the nation states that we understand today. Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, and everything else. So this is the experience of the Chinese who live overseas in Southeast Asia. They had such possibilities, which we will look at later. But again, one must be reminded that it's not always transnational. This experience also had its own constraint, which is the empire, the colonial empire, and also the subsequent nation states. So far so good? Or are you already lost? Okay, the boring part, last one. Sorry. The Chinese, when they move overseas, there is this notion that they always have, which is, are we still on? No. Can we get some help? When the Chinese move overseas, I think you caught a word there, diaspora. Diaspora is a very funny word because it came from the Jewish experience of returning to Jerusalem. See you in Jerusalem, right? So that's the idea. So the Chinese experience, because we can't find a suitable word for it, so we use the word diaspora. Diaspora means you're going out, but you want to go back to it again, right? So this idea of this link. So on one hand, you have an idea of separation from the fatherland. I use the word fatherland. Some people say, why do you use fatherland? Why not motherland? Right? Because the Chinese say 祖国, which is your grandfather's, your ancestors, but maternal side, paternal side, not the maternal side. So not motherland, but fatherland. Right? So in Indonesia, what do you say? Motherland. What is the word in Indonesia? Ibu Pertiwi. Ibu. Is it? Mother, they say. Ibu Pertiwi. Whereas in the Chinese, they say 主. Or 主 has to be man. Right? Of course, you can say 祖母, which is your grandmother. Right? But never mind. So, the idea is that you separate yourself from the state, from your own fatherland, your ancestor land. But you still maintain links with it. Through letters, through news that came from China, through reading of newspapers or what happened in China. So in that sense, a lot of events that took place in China actually affected the Chinese overseas. The Chinese overseas, for instance, in their schooling system, when May 4th movement happened in China in 1919, it transformed the education system in China into modern using modern education system. That same process actually came down to Southeast Asia. All over Southeast Asia, you find schools began to throw away dialect, teaching in dialect, started to teach in Mandarin. Not classical Mandarin, but the ordinary Mandarin, one which everyone can understand. So, in that sense, they liberalized education. So that process happened in China. It trickled down all the way to Southeast Asia. And in that sense, events in the fatherland actually affected the Chinese in Southeast Asia. But at the same time, we also realized that as we began to understand more about the Chinese experience in Southeast Asia, we also realized that they too, in some aspects, affected events in China, or at least contributed some elements of change to China, which we will look at later on. In Southeast Asia, while they live in Southeast Asia, some of them have lived here for generations. Many of them 3-4 generations. Others 10, 8 generations, which are rare, but still you would be able to find them, especially in Indonesia. You'll find some families which are very, very old because they have been here for many, many generations. They have their own networks of doing things. So, be it a trading network, be it a cultural organizational network, or be it a kind of mutual help kind of network, they all have established this kind of networks. So this kind of networks also transcend boundaries. In other words, they were not bound in some elements, some aspects, they were not bound by the colonial empire's boundaries. They were not bound later on by the nation-state boundaries. So you find a lot of things actually transcended boundaries. So in Southeast Asia, that happened. And also there are also certain elements of transfer of technologies, which we'll look at later, and maybe some aspects of transfer of ideas as well, that actually happened during this time. So all these themes that we are going to look at will be able to, I don't know if you will be able to get more from this, but try to follow through. Now, I got a question. What's the difference between Chinese overseas and overseas Chinese? Apart from the fact that they are terbalik. You know, terbalik means upside down. Hello, anyone, please. Yes. Okay. That's one aspect. Very good. You would like to try?
Yes, Chinese overseas is the Chinese passport.
Sorry?
Chinese overseas is the Chinese passport.
Okay.
Yes, and overseas Chinese might already recently visited for too long and probably already has their families in the community. And
Good.
changes the citizenship.
We will say, what does that mean? Yes and no. Some?
I think overseas Chinese, these are the Chinese who work outside China, but they have the intention to return, similar to an overseas Filipino worker. And a Chinese overseas is someone who was born in that particular country, not necessarily native to the Chinese, but he became integrated.
None of you actually got it wrong. None of you actually got it wrong. Everyone has contributed something. Who am I? Am I overseas Chinese or Chinese overseas?
Overseas Chinese.
Overseas Chinese. That's wrong. Right? Why? Because if we want to understand these two terms, Chinese overseas and overseas Chinese, we need to cut it with time. Okay, first of all, today we look at all the Chinese who live outside of China as Chinese overseas, right? Chinese overseas. So including me, I'm a Chinese by descent. I'm the fifth generation of my family in Malaysia, and I live in Malaysia, but I'm not a citizen of Malaysia. I'm a Malaysian passport holder. So who am I? I'm a Malaysian citizen, but I am a Chinese overseas, right? But if you talk about overseas Chinese, it could mean people like what you described just now, with a Chinese passport, right? Chinese national, and therefore he will be a overseas Chinese. But this overseas Chinese can also, at the same time, be considered a Chinese overseas. Have I confused you, or we keep on using these two terms? Right? Are you clear so far? Now let's go back to in time and go back to the period before nation states in Southeast Asia were formed, where the countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines all giving out citizenship, right? Before that, all the Chinese were considered Chinese nationals, and therefore they were considered overseas Chinese. And that has a political connotation to it, and at certain points it became problematic as well, right? Okay. This is how it stands in terms of the Chinese in Southeast Asia. What is the population of ASEAN? Oh dear. What is the population of ASEAN?
About 500 million.
About 500 million. You look at the number of Chinese. If you add up all these figures together, you get no more than 30 million. Right? Just about 30 million. Which means what? It's about 8% or 7% of the total population. Which is actually quite significant in that sense. Right? 7-8%. In some countries like Singapore, 76% of the populations are Chinese, but it only made up 2.6 million people. In my country, we have about 7 million people, but it contributed 22%, only 22% of the population. Whereas little Brunei has 0.04, 42,000 of the Chinese, but it makes up 10% of the population because Brunei has only 450,000 people. So in each country, Chinese, overseas, Chinese population made up different percentage, and therefore they are In some countries, they are very significant, like Malaysia. Malaysian Chinese are a minority, but it's a sizable minority that you cannot ignore. And therefore, it has certain role, political role as well in that country. It's a strong political role, although diminishing all the time because of the low birth rate of the Chinese. Chinese, in the past, people say, if you have a Chinese family with one kid, that's unthinkable 50 years ago. Today, if you have 3 kids or 4 kids in your family, people say you're crazy. Too many, right? Because the idea of birth rate has been going down among the Chinese. So therefore, you look at the representation of this group of people. Some places they are small, some places they are big. They're much larger, but they all play a very significant role, especially traditionally in the economic sphere. Right? So you always find that the Chinese always, they look at the Chinese, they say, oh, rich people. Is that true? No. In fact, most Chinese are not rich. They are very poor. Not really poor, but they are just ordinary folks. Only a handful of them are rich. But the thing is, these people who are so-called rich and so on, they may be in control of a large chunk of the economy, and therefore they are still very significant. But of course today, Chinese in Southeast Asia are part and parcel of the nation state, and therefore they are contributing differently to their different countries. Now let us come to this experience, Chinese experience in Southeast Asia, which I am going to divide into 4 aspects, which is laborers, merchants, overseas Chinese. Therefore, the word overseas Chinese is there, right? So the overseas Chinese is an experience by itself. And finally, citizens, new migrants that we talked about just now. The idea actually came from Professor Wong. History will tell us that Chinese already in Southeast Asia since very early time. In Srivijaya, you find traces of them. In Angkor, you also find them. But of course, we will remember the Ming Dynasty being one of those most important ones, because the Admiral Zheng He came down with his great armada. And up to 1433, Chinese presence in Southeast Asia was quite significant because of these voyages and so on. But when it's finally stopped in 1433, you still find that Chinese continue to come down to Southeast Asia, although the imperial government actually banned them many times from coming down, but yet they still come down. So we have, for instance, in early 19th century, a report in the imperial code. The emperor received a report from the governor of Tuguang. Tuguang means Guangdong and Guangxi provinces. So what did this report? What did the governor reported? He reported that there was a man who came back from Batavia, right? In Jakarta today. So he was reported to have come back, or he was reported to have stayed illegally overseas for many years, and he came back with a lot of money. Can we execute him? Because he defied the ban. He went abroad. You're not supposed to go abroad, let alone stay there for many years. So he stayed there for many years, and he came back. Finally, he wanted to come back, diasporic in that sense. He wanted to come back. And the governor said he has to be punished. So he asked the emperor whether he could be executed, as what the law would demand at that time. The emperor said, no, jail him one day, and then confiscate all his money and build school. So that's the wisdom of the emperor at that time. But the idea is that this guy has been living abroad for many years, even though there were bans, imperial laws saying that he cannot go abroad, but yet he went abroad. So Chinese continue to arrive, even though there were bans. And of course, when they arrive in large number, they set up settlements. Settlements in Batavia, in Manila, Malacca, Saigon, in Hoi An, and also in Bangkok. And even in Java, you have Tangerang, which is today Benteng area. So this is something that you can see happening all the time. And of course, when the Chinese arrived in large number, people were finding that, maybe they became a nuisance or whatever. So there were different programs, anti-Chinese campaign against these people. And in 1740s, for instance, you have a massacre here that actually took place, killed off a lot of Chinese. In Manila as well, there were massacres against the Chinese and so on. So this experience of the early experience was very significant in shaping the idea, the relationship between the Chinese and also the indigenous community, which is not always comfortable. There is always an element of suspicion. There's always an element of uncomfortable. So which lasted until today, which we'll see later on. But these early arrivals were very small in numbers. Even though we are talking about 10,000, 20,000, they are still small. The Chinese that we see today in Southeast Asia are the descendants of those who came after 1850s because of the Western colonization process which demanded Chinese labor. So that you see the descendants of these people came from 1850s onwards. Push and pull factor for migration, very clear. Push factor, events in China. China during the 19th century is a place that you don't want to live in, right? Because life there can be very harsh. You will find rebellions such as the Taiping rebellions that took place 1850s to 1864 that ravaged the entire southern region of China. Why? Because you have 14 years of constant war. Can you imagine? We all live in very peaceful time now. We cannot visualize war. Even if we would look at the Middle East and so on, we still cannot empathize because we did not experience it. Right? But war during those days, scary, very scary. I don't know how scary, but I can imagine that it's very scary. You also have the Muslim rebellion against the Manchu government. And when you have war, life cannot be normal. It's just like today we're having a class here, so peaceful, with aircon, with all this technology, right? Happy. What if suddenly someone threw a grenade into this building? Can you imagine that kind of ravage and so on? Life can be harsh because of very scarce resources. Land, after many generations of division by the families itself, and also by the selling of a lot of land and so on, you find that many people cannot survive on the land. And many families have a lot of children to feed, a lot of mouths to feed. So life can be very harsh. Disasters, right? I was told that, yes, this morning we had earthquake, was it? Yes. Did you feel it? Yes. I don't know, I said true. So that's disaster, right? And these disasters can be natural, but it can also be man-made. Man-made, for instance, in China, there were a lot of dikes to control flood. If the local government failed to look after these dikes because of corruption or because of neglect, then the flood will happen. What happens if you have flood? Oh, you can swim in it. Pull factor. The pull factor is very important. News coming back from Southeast Asia. Hey, this guy became rich. This guy brought back money. Plenty of silver coins. This guy built new mansion, bought land. with money from overseas. Good life, good place to go to. And of course, at the same time, the Western enterprises, which included some Chinese capital with it, began to attract a lot of Chinese laborers. Recruiting of Chinese laborers. There is a word for it, Hua Gong. Hua means Chinese, Gong means laborers. So the recruiting of Chinese laborers taking place. And, well, it's good to go. I tell you, it's actually a very interesting experience. I went to my mother's village in Guangdong. And I thought it's very near. I traveled don't know how many miles in a van and finally arrived at this village. I looked at the village and said, no wonder they left the village. It's just impossible to live in that place. Right? So life abroad will be much more attractive. So they went abroad for better life. That's a 1913 picture of a group of young boys and girls. This is a group of settlers. They are not laborers. They were asked to go in families. So migration process was not just labor, but you also have settlers, people who came down, given land by the government and so on. So you find children coming down as well. So if you have a chance to look at them closely, they all look very, very cute. Okay, labor. Western enterprises started in Southeast Asia, so you have commercial crops that demanded labor. For a while, some places like British Empire refused to employ indigenous community because they said the locals should be left alone to their own lives so that they can continue to produce food stuff, right? Whereas the commercial enterprises will earn them wages, which they have to know how to manage. So not suitable. So outside laborers were required. So Chinese were brought in, and then you have also Indians, for instance. In the case of British Empire, you also recruited people from Java, from Gadjah, and so on. Why? Because there was explosion of population in Java. So you have excess of population, and they were recruited in the British Empire. In French Indochina, in Cambodia, a lot of laborers came from Vietnam, for instance. These are intra-regional recruitment. But you find that Chinese were also brought in large numbers. You also have merchants coming down to work, to start business wherever you have a town, and therefore you can see Chinatown in a lot of places. In some places, which we'll talk about later, in Malaysia, virtually all the towns are Chinatown. Have you been to Malaysia? If you've been to Kuala Lumpur, you find, wow, this is Chinatown. Right? Is this China? Well, maybe southern China. Mines, plantations, and also you find that they recruited a lot of people. Just now we talked about one of the cool factors was better life in Southeast Asia. But many of them, when they ended up here in Southeast Asia, it's a nightmare. It's a hell on earth. Why? Because when they entered the plantations, they began to realize that life in plantations are very harsh. Casualty rates can be very high. In some places as high as 80 to 85%. Meaning to say, if you entered and worked in an estate, your chances you to survive is only 15 to 20%. Meaning to say, you may not last 3 years. You may just drop off within that 3 years of contract. And life can be very cruel. And therefore, many of them also move from one place to another within Southeast Asia, right? So you see some pictures, laborers in coal mines and also in rubber estates, but you also find many of them died. These are the more fortunate ones with tombstone. Many have no tomb to remember them. This plaque, of course, you can't see anything, neither can I now. But if you go and examine this plaque, this is a plaque in a temple. Commemorate the restoration of the temple in 1887 in Samarkand. You find some examples from Sabah where I've done a bit more work. In this plaque, you find a lot of names of single women, which will tell you that actually these names are very fancy and glamorous names because they were not ordinary women. They were songsters or maybe even prostitutes, because when you have thousands of workers, single men living in certain places, you need entertainment, you need this kind of facilities. So these people were recruited to work as songsters, prostitutes, or whatever they want to call them. So they have some names left behind. Of course, these are their trade name, not their personal name. So this Chinese experience is also another aspect of experience which not many people will look into. The second group will be the merchants. These merchants came about maybe around, mostly came since 1880s. I use the word since because they continue to come down, just as the laborers continue to come down even after 1850s. The merchants followed the Western enterprises. Many of them brought capital with them. Some just started some shops, businesses, shopkeepers we call them, but others actually brought capital to invest on land. So they too became the estate owners, became the owners of mines, tin mines and so on. Some of them bought ships to transport things. The magnitude, the scale of the economy, you have to start imagining the way they were doing business at that time. They were really, really big. So this is something that you have to understand. Then some of them actually dealt with the government on revenue farms, to trade in opium, to run gambling houses as a form of entertainment to the laborers and so on. And of course, because they were rich, they became a separate class and they started organizations, and also they became de facto leaders of their communities. So in Southeast Asia, the leaders of the community has always been the Taukes. Have you heard of the word Taukes? Taukes means big boss, right? Big boss. So they own businesses, but they were also considered leaders of their own communities. So the leaders here were not Confucianist trained. They were not your Mandarin scholars. They were your business leaders. So the way of doing things, the way they thought, would be very different, say, compared to an officials from the Mandarin class. And of course, they will trade with one another that transcend boundaries as well. You notice that in our records, we found many of them actually traded, buying things from all over Southeast Asia. Like for instance, in Malacca, we have someone, in Penang, sorry, we have someone who bought charcoal, shiploads of charcoals coming from Haiphong in northern Vietnam in order to be used, to be sold in Penang, because there were not enough in Penang, so they have to import. And they were trading among themselves. So many of them became officials, wearing all sorts of garments, the official garments and so on. They took part in, became leaders of the Huiguan, or the guild halls. Like for instance here in Java, you have Tionghoa Huiguan. You also have temple leaders, Kapitan China, captain of the Chinese, the leaders of the Chinese Chamber of Commerce, Chinese advisory boards. Then the Manchu government began to appoint some of them as vice consul. So they have certain official status, and therefore some of them were able to wear this kind of garment, which is the imperial garment. And then, of course, later on, they were also represented in the sanitary board. Some were in the Federal Council, which is the law-making decision body, Volksraad in the case of the Dutch Indies, and also Federal Council in the case of the British Malaya. Here, I give you two examples. One is Zhang Bishi, the guy on top. He made his fortune in Mada. But later on, he was appointed Vice Consul in Penang, across, in British Malaya. From Dutch Indies became a Vice Consul in British Malaya, in British territories. Invested in railway construction, not in Malaya nor here, but in China. So this is where contributing to China, making changes in China. And he started a winery. What's so special about Chinese wine? Chinese wine is white color. Do you know that? Chinese always drink white wine. Very fragrant, with a lot of good smell and so on. But this guy started a red wine factory. Where? In Shandong. It's actually a Western enterprise. So this is something interesting. So whenever I drink wine in China, I say, this is Zhang Bishi. Zhang Bishi's doing, right? Hong Naixiang, Wong Naixiang, was from Fuzhou. He led a group of migrants to Cebu in Sarawak. When he landed there, he started this community and so on. And later on, he was a Christian, Methodist Christian, and he was the father-in-law to Dr. Lim Boon Keng. If you don't know Lim Boon Keng, search up this guy. Trained in Edinburgh as a medical doctor and things like that. Very westernized, and then later on became Confucianized. And later on, Hong Naixiang became a mentri, a minister in China to look after railway. Again, it's an investment kind of thing. Now let us consider some of this idea about technological transfer, which fits into maybe transnational thing. First, mining technology. Chinese were brought in for a lot of mining activities. Gold mine, silver mine, no silver mine, tin mine and coal mines. So they were all over Southeast Asia. Many of them Hakka, the Hakka gold miners. In Bangka, Belitung, for instance, all these were Hakka people. So if you look into their lives, they brought in technology like open cast mining technology. This is something that the people here would not use, but then the Chinese brought in such technology. When they live here in large numbers, they began to suffer because of their climates, because of their health. They brought in new plants. You know the bok choy? The little bok choy that we eat here, that's Chinese. So they brought in different kind of seeds to plant so that they can continue to live in a very normal life. And today, these things survive. And of course, Chinese herbs. Chinese herbs is something that you find Chinese medicine halls all over Southeast Asia, and that became part and parcel of our life in Southeast Asia. If you are sick, where do you go? Do you go to a Western doctor or do you go to a Chinese doctor, Chinese sensei? Why do you go to Chinese sensei?
I don't really trust Western
Our friend here, Melo, doesn't trust Western medicine. Oh dear. All the doctors in the world.
Has been around for millennia, so it's more credible.
Okay, let me tell you how I will look at it. If I break my leg, because I fall from the lecture hall, right? I will go to a Western doctor immediately, right? If I have a high fever, I'll go to a Western doctor. But if I were to lose my voice because I talk too much, I will go to a Chinese medicine hall. Why? Then they will prescribe me something. They will do this. They will write something, right? And then they say, okay, you're too heaty here, too much of belacan or whatnot, right? Then they say, okay, you will have this medicine. When you open up in the pack, when you open up, you've got to see all these strange things, insects, shells of certain things, maybe the tail of a lizard or whatever, and also a seahorse, dried seahorse thrown into it. Then you're supposed to boil 3 balls of water into 1 ball. Meaning to say you're supposed to heat it for a long time, then you get the medicine and you drink. And you're not, after 1 course, you won't get well. You have to take 2-3 times because it's a gradual adjustment of your balance. Because you're off balance just now. So now you're supposed to balance. So this is the way Chinese medicine will heal you. But if you had a high fever, never go to a Chinese doctor because you probably died in the course of drinking that medicine. Then, of course, we are looking at possible trade network. A lot of the medicine that we talk about will come through Guangzhou, and also Hong Kong. So, and most of these will be done by the Yongding people. Yongding people who live on the Fujian side of the province. Supply chain in Vietnam and northern Thai actually started because of such demand, right, in Chinese medicine. Because many of the Chinese medicines are now being manufactured locally in Southeast Asia. Pawn shop. Have you heard of pawn shop? Huh? Pajak gadai. Is it gadai? Tempat. You go and pawn. Let's say I don't have money now. I will pawn my spectacle, right? Gadai. Right? Gadai. So pawn shop network is a huge network, and it's very exclusive as well. It's not just everyone can go into it. Because some families are in control. The Dapu Hakka, all over Southeast Asia, and many of them having the same surname of Lan, blue-colored Lan, Sing Lan, right? Their surname is Lan or Lam, as they would call them because they are Hakka, Lam. So these people run pawn shop all over Southeast Asia, not just in British Malaya, but they were all over Southeast Asia, and they were very exclusive. By doing that, they were again transnational in a way, right? Bird nest industry. This is something which lately I got interested. I began to look into all these limestone caves. Not that I go and visit them, but I look at them from the maps and so on. Borneo, Sumatra, all over you find limestone caves. Demand in China and Hong Kong, crazy. Do you know what's bird nest? It's the saliva of the bird that turned into a kind of gelatin or whatnot, tasteless. But the emperor eat it almost daily, with sweetener, of course, right, to make it palatable. Because of such demand in Hong Kong and China, the Chinese in Southeast Asia started this network of working together, not just among themselves, but also with the indigenous people, and they started to gather, process, export. This whole process is very important to understand transnational network. Let us come to the third one, overseas Chinese. The Chinese experience of being overseas Chinese. This started in 1912 with the new republic in China. You know what happened in China, right? So the fall of the Manchu dynasty and the Chinese government. That's the original flag of the Chinese Republic, 5 color, representing the 5 major ethnic groups. And later on, that is the Taiwan flag now today, right? So the Chinese government began to exert control over the Chinese overseas. And they considered the Chinese who live abroad being Chinese national. And therefore they began to take an interest in them. Not just because they want to take care of them, but they also needed support from Southeast Asia, money especially, and also technology, knowledge, because many Southeast Asian Chinese and also those who live in Europe and America had Western knowledge that were useful to build a new republic, new China. So they were wanted in that sense. So the Chinese government began to take an interest. Registration. First they registered them, right? Then they began to take care of their education. Everyone read the same textbook. Everyone started to have the same lessons because there is a Ministry of Education that dispenses all this kind of syllabus, textbooks, even exported teachers, and so on. Have you heard of Professor Wong? At least you know the name, right? His father was a teacher sent down to teach in one of the schools in Sumatra. It was in Sumatra, right? So he was sent. Was it Sumatra or Java? I can't remember. May 4th movement. When May 4th movement took place, replacing all the old things in China, it also happened in Southeast Asia. So that's the kind of effect that we are looking into. Reaction to national Chinese identity. Look carefully into the picture. This is a picture of a school in Chinatown. It's a very well organized school band kind of thing, orchestra, right? So you cannot imagine before the war they were already organized like this. But look at the logo there. That's the logo of the Chinese Republic of that time. So you can see how strong was it. But of course, when you have such strong representation, you also have reaction to it. So you can see Thailand in 1930s to 1950s, you have Marshal Fibun Songkram, right? Although he was part Chinese, he put in measures to stop Chinese language from being taught in Thailand, for instance. British exerted control over Chinese schools, trying to cut off all these logos, ban textbooks from being circulated and so on. And also teachers, if they misbehave, send them back to China. Because they were only given 1 year license. Every year you've got to renew your license to teach in British Malaya, for instance. So all this became part and parcel of the reaction. Of course, the reactions much more than this. Of course, the Chinese the overseas Chinese also began to take notice of their own country, the fortune of their country. So when China was at war against Japan, or rather when Japan attacked China, many Chinese actually returned to China. Although many of them were already 4th, 5th generation in Java, in Burma, in Vietnam, they went back, inverted comma, to China, back to China, to serve in the army, to serve in the Hua Gong, which is the Ji Gong, Hua Qiao Ji Gong, which is to become mechanic and drivers on the Burma-Lidu road, to keep the supply route open. Otherwise, China will be starved to death. No more weapons to fight. So that's 3,000 of them came from Southeast Asia, and we have their names, all their names today. You can find them, all these names. So there were these pictures taken before they left for China. Then you have Tan Kah-Ki, this old man Tan Kah-Ki, who started Xiamen University in China. He too contributed to the war efforts in China. So overseas Chinese began to identify themselves with China. So that the notion of being Chinese is the Chinese of China, not Chinese of Southeast Asia. So this idea is actually very problematic at that time. Last experience is the experience of being new migrants. Now, in the literature, Professor Wong actually talks about post-1945, especially post-1949, new migrants. He was using the word new migrants. But I changed it slightly different because I would say that first thing first, citizen. The experience of turning to become citizen. You find that the new migrants began to go abroad over the last 40 years. Many of them settled abroad. First, after Deng Xiaoping said, let's change, let's modernize, right? In 1978, China began to send up a lot of students. Many of them did not come back because they stayed on. And they went on to become great professors, great professionals, and so on, in all over the world. So today, if you go to Italy, you find many Chinese speaking Italian, like Italian, because they are Italian, right? Because they have been there, becoming citizens, born there, bred there, and they are Italians. 40 years, very fast. How old are you? 20-something, right? So if you are 20-something, imagine 40, you're going to touch 40 very soon. And economic development and business opportunity prompted many to go abroad and live there. And therefore, they became part of that expatriates kind of experience. But in Southeast Asia, we are talking about slightly different. Because this group of people, when they came out, many of them cannot stay in Southeast Asia forever. They cannot become citizens of Southeast Asia, except maybe in Singapore. Because Singapore absorbed them in large numbers, but not in Indonesia. Definitely not in Malaysia, because we have race issue and things like that. So you cannot absorb that. But in Singapore, they did. So in the case of Southeast Asia, we are looking into citizens. We are looking into Chinese taking part in the political process of those countries. Like for instance, in Malaysia and Singapore, you have Malayan Chinese Association, People's Action Party, DAP, you can have Socialist Front, all these things. You can find Chinese taking leadership role. So you find Lee Kuan Yew, bottom there, and his former comrades and later on became enemy Lin Chin-xiang. So if you don't understand this, go and read up on PAP history, Singapore history, you'll find very interesting stories about these two men. In Indonesia, in as early as 1928, Sumpah Pemuda, already there were three or four Chinese taking part in that swearing of an oath to establish a new republic, or at least the aspiration of having this new republic called Indonesia. There were Chinese in it. In Philippines, as early as the late 19th century, you find people like Rizal, Bonifacio, Andre Bonifacio, Emil Aquinado, and General Luna. They were all mestizo, Chinese mestizo, people with a bit of Chinese blood or some Chinese blood, and they were taking part in the political process of this country. Of course, they don't call themselves Chinese. In the case of Philippines, they say Filipino, right? So in the case of Rizal, they call him even Malayu, Malay. Loyalty. In the process of political process, being part of the political process, many of the Chinese loyalty to Southeast Asian countries became, or rather being questioned. So because of New China is a communist China, so many of them in British Malaya and Singapore became victims because they were anti-British, some of them were communists. So they were repatriated to China, sent back to China. Sent to a China which they could not understand, actually, because China already changed. Those remain as Chinese. The question of Chinese versus national citizen, whether they are supposed to be Chinese citizen or citizen of the new country. So like for instance in Indonesia, dual nationality treaty, 1962? There was this treaty signed between the two countries of China and Indonesia, and because of that, many decided to go back to China. Don't want to be part of this country, for instance. Then, of course, in 1965, in Indonesia, you have the Gestapo. Right? September 30th, many Chinese were asked to go, and many of them actually left. In Vietnam, anti-Chinese campaign, South Vietnam, during the Vietnam War, they were anti-Chinese as well. In the case of after Vietnam Socialist Republic was established, there were anti-Chinese campaign in 1978, 79 as well. That picture, those pictures, first one, repatriation process. So these were the repatriation process from Singapore and Malaya. This was 1998, Jakarta, riot, racial riot because of the fall of Sukarno, but somehow the Chinese were targeted. So many of the Chinese also took part in the political process of their respective countries. In the case of Sabah, where I come from, I'm from Sabah, there was, when we became part of Malaysia, the proclamation of independence, we have a Chinese reading that proclamation in Chinese, for instance. So this became, in other words, recognition of being part of the nation state. Of course, they're also defending the new nation state, the new nation. Many of them joined the armed forces. In some countries, they were not allowed to join the armed forces, right? Unless they become citizens of the country. New migrants only recently. This is what Professor Wong was talking about, the new migrants. These are the people who went out 40 years ago or since 40 years ago. Education, they went out, then they worked elsewhere, and now, because of Chinese investment in Southeast Asia, became so big, so large, they too became part and parcel of that process. So many Chinese came out to work for Chinese corporation. They stayed on, some worked for a while. After several years, they returned to China. But their experience is something very interesting. They have their own schools, they have their own life, they have their own supporting system, even babysitters for their children. And their experience, if you examine carefully, you find that they were very, truly transnational. Okay, let me stop. I'm going to stop here because I was told that I better stop. Because you're supposed to say something, not just one-way traffic. But this is the last part, which I'm going to leave these slides with you. Right? There are several things that we are supposed to look at. If you look into the experience of the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the notion of transnational history, transnational experience, can also be seen from 4 themes here. Number 1, Chinatown. We mentioned a bit just now, Chinatown. Chinatown can be very attractive in some places. You find certain places having their own Chinatowns. But in places like Malaysia, you don't find Chinatown. In Jakarta, where's the place? Is it Glodok? Yeah, Glodok, right? In Manila is in Intramuros, and also there's another place? Binondo. In Western countries, you always find Chinatown with a pavilion, Chinatown, right? Chinatown. But if you come to places like I said just now, you go to Penang, some of you been to Penang, or you go to Singapore, that's Chinatown all over. Right? So the experience will be very different. But most importantly is that they work. This Chinatown actually have networks. They actually link to one another. Another thing would be, this is a very important theme that I was hoping to develop further with you, but we don't have enough time, which is hybridity, hybrid communities. When the Chinese came, they came alone. Some of them married locals, indigenous communities. So they have children who are mixed blood. But at the same time, even if they were not of mixed blood, many of them adopted local culture. So you have words like Peranakan, right? You have Sangli in the case of Philippines. You also have Mestizo, Chinese Mestizo. You have in Thailand, Lukjin, right? Lukjin. You also have place like Vietnam, Minh Hưng, the Minh Hưng of Hội An, right? So all these straight-born Chinese, you go to Singapore, straight-born Chinese, Peranakan, the word Peranakan. Although sometimes the word Peranakan can be quite problematic. So some of them were of blood lineage, some of them of culture. So you find dressing, food, literature will be different and so on. In Sabah, again, I give you the case of Sabah, there are Sino natives. The guy's name is Richard Yap. Yap, as in Ye, his surname. But he cannot speak Chinese because he is a Gadjah, a Sino Gadjah. So he was reading the Proclamation of Independence in Gadjah. So you can see his head here. Third one is religious activities. A lot of activities, religious activities in Southeast Asia are interconnected with one another. So even Buddhism, Christianity, and also Chinese temples. Okay, this is something that you have to look at. This guy is actually called Datuk Gong. Datuk means Datuk as in an honorific title in Malay archipelago. Gong is also means grandfather or also honorific title, right, of a Chinese. So it's a mix. This guy and this guy, they are supposed to represent the same thing, but it's just that this guy is supposed to look after China, Chinese, and so on. This guy, because he was in Malaya and also in Indonesia, so he wears a tongkolok, and he carries a kreese, not something prosperity, right? Interesting. So this is a study. I have a student working on this topic. Exciting. I was looking at him. I wish I was working on that topic, right? So it's a syncretization of both sides of the world. Of course, the Chinese deity all over, all these Chinese deities, and they all have regional network. You go and look at their donors, people who donated money to the temples. You find it's not confined to the local. It's coming from all over, transcend boundaries. Some as far as Vietnam, in Malaysia, you can find temples having people donated money from Indonesia, from Vietnam, all over. Christianity as well, no difference. Yeah? A lot of this, I will not talk about, I will not dwell on it. The last one is Transnational Chinese Organization. The first one will be the Nanyang Hakka Organization. Do you know Happy Villa in Singapore? This is the, you know the little ointment called Tiger Balm? In Singapore, you always find that. That's a founder. He made his fortune from those little ointment. Right? And he was a Hakka. He wanted the Hakka to be united, to contribute to China. So he started this organization, which transcends boundaries. And today, you have World Federation of Hakka, World Hakka Convention, Teochew International Federation, and they are world transcending boundaries. I was in Vietnam interviewing some Hakka leaders, and they were telling me, please finish fast because we got a flight to catch. Where to? Taiwan. Why? to attend Hakka World Hakka Federation. I said, you don't speak Hakka because they already lost their Hakka. You can't speak. But they said, yeah, but we are Hakka, and that's very good business opportunities. Right? So, transnational history is actually exciting, if you ask me. What I've given you may not necessarily be all transnational. There are bits and pieces here and there. But as I mentioned, you can actually glean from it. Certain part of it, they are transnational. But this is being introductory, we cannot talk more. We can talk for 2 more days, I can still continue to talk. After that, I got to take my medicine. Right? But more importantly is that this idea, when you look at the Chinese again, the moment you're out of this room, when you see a Chinese, all right, a Tianghua guy, right, in this country, you may have a different notion about him altogether now. Maybe. Or maybe next time when you go and do further studies on your, maybe a master's or PhD, the Chinese can be a very exciting topic to work on because there's so many aspects of it. Different layers, different time and space as well. So, any question? I exceeded my time actually. Any question? Any comments? I disagree with you. Yes. Okay. Okay, Prof.
Okay, Professor Damsi.
Kenny.
Kenny.
I don't know.
So thank you for your presentation. But what I want to ask is, one of the factors who push Chinese to migrate from China is the rebellion, like a rebellion, Muslim rebellion. What I want to say is, but when you tell me about Sino-Japan war, Japan-China war, you say that many Chinese present to China in order to make contribution to the war. What I want to ask is there any immigration in China? Same as before.
Yes.
The immigration process went on until 1952, I think. Basically, after 49, many of them came up to Hong Kong and then come down to Southeast Asia. The process went on, but during wartime, as you know, the process of movement would be constrained by transportation. So you can't really move too much. And at that time, China, of course, was at war with Japan. And almost half of China gone and came under Japanese rule. So either you take a Japanese ship to come down, whatever maru, Chinese ship always have the word maru at the back, you come down, or you probably have to walk very far to come down, which is via Vietnam and so on, which is not impossible, but it's just that the migration process has come down to almost nothing during the wartime. So by 1937-38, a lot of the ports in China were closed already, but the southern ports remained open until about 1940. So migration process actually went on until such time. As late as 1941, December, people were still traveling to Hong Kong, for instance, no issue. But the moment the Japanese attacked Hong Kong, that's the end of it. You can travel, but it's just that you have to take a Japanese sanctioned kind of ship. So yeah, it went on. Yeah. Any problems, please?
Yes, I do have a question. Because you have talked about the periodization of the Chinese immigration. So the modern laborers recruited by Western enterprises mainly came after the 50s, and the majority of the modern merchants
1880s.
1880s. But there were already significant Chinese presence in Nusantara way before that, like in the 1700s. You have the small numbers but significant merchant communities. Do you see any inheritance or continuation between these, the previous kind of pre-1840s Chinese communities here and the large, mass level of Chinese migration afterwards? Do you see like a lot of connections in between, or do you see that there's kind of a break in between?
The idea of seeing such connectivity is very important. But at this moment, based on existing work, existing literature, we just find very little of it. Because the early migrants were of certain lineage. They came from certain areas. So some of them came as far as places like Ningbo and things like that. But majority, of course, came from Quanzhou and Zhangzhou in Fujian province. So, but then that link is not that it did not exist. It's just that we didn't have enough studies on it. So perhaps you may want to do a study on that. Yeah, but really, it's something that is important because what we could see is that I have a student who just published a book on a family history, a family business history, and she was able to trace that the family business started its branch, original business in Guangzhou, the main city, then having a branch in Hong Kong, and then the father, or rather the grandfather, started a business in Kuala Lumpur. And this guy was born in China, grew up in China, sent to Cambridge to study, and when on his way back, he was asked to help his father's shop in Malaya. And then he started another branch of business, tin mining. Because the family was doing silk. They were selling silk, high-class silk. Then he said, that's not profitable, not exciting, not enough money. So he went into tin mining. And then he became the first finance minister of Malaya, which is quite interesting in that sense. So in that sense, this is of course a late 19th century, 20th century phenomenon. But what you're saying is probably exists, should exist, just that we know next to nothing about it. Not enough information. Right? Next time, you work. Anyone? Please.
Yes, I have a question regarding the methodology. Yes, because a lot of Chinese live in Southeast Asia are already immigrated for a very long time, and the culture of their own is already assimilated into the local culture.
Yes.
And then sometimes you have problem distinguishing between Chinese and the local Indonesian or local Malays. So, do you have any suggestion which one is the most efficient way to do that?
The notion of this periodization that I put in are only to represent the majority. So in other words, when you say laborers coming down 1850s in large numbers, that's since 1850s, that's because the majority came down after 1850s. Prior to that, of course, the Chinese were already there. Many of them came to work as well. In fact, as early as 1856, the Chinese already fighting a war among themselves in Perak, in Selangor, in Malaya. Over what? Over tin mine. Who killed who? Hakka killing Hakka. In other words, they were already there. But just that how we distinguish this would be majority. But the idea of those people who intermarried, for instance, assimilated into the local culture, for instance, how to distinguish them, how to position them, well, that is actually one very big question.
And also, like, you don't speak their languages. Sometimes when you conduct research there, you speak one or two languages, because the language there is multiple, maybe 7 or...
Well, you better ask yourself whether you're in the right trade. Because most historians have to speak, at least learn to speak or learn to read many languages. Right? I have to learn Vietnamese, poor me. Any Vietnamese friends here? 清远则口面 Understand? Translate?
He said that Vietnamese is very hard, very hard.
Very difficult. Right? It's terrible. And I also have to learn French because I work in Vietnam. Right? The langue française est très difficile. It's the same meaning. The French language is terrible. It's terrible. Right? Why? I don't understand gender. A table is supposed to be a female. A room is supposed to be a female. What kind of conjugation and things like that? So you are in a business of, you're in a trade that is going to be very tough. If you want to be part of it, learn the language. So we have to learn. Of course, growing up in Southeast Asia, we have some advantages because we speak the Malay language. For me, I can operate perhaps in Indonesia as well. Not as good because some words are really different. When I first arrived in Palembang, my first visit to Indonesia was in Palembang, not in Jakarta. There was a train accident, so the news came out. 230 orang korban. I said, oh dear, korban means die in Malay language. Whereas in Indonesian language, then after that they said, 7 orang tewas. Tewas. I said, tewas means football, you tewas, ditewaskan, kalah, means you lost a football match. How come tewas? And then you have the word korban. Korban for me means Hari Raya Korban, right? Your sacrifice. It's 230 korban, and then why 7 tewas? It doesn't make sense. Korban means victims or people who were involved in that accident in a sense. But whether they were killed, died, and so on, tewas means they died. Oh, how different, right? But then, well, I can still operate to some extent, can say terima kasih and things like that, right? Visa. Language, growing up in Southeast Asia, gives us a little bit advantage because I can speak Malay, I can speak Hakka, Cantonese, Mandarin. So, because we all grow up in towns, so you speak, whenever you are in Penang, you have to speak Hokkien, which I know next to nothing. But if you grow up in Manila, you probably will be able to speak Hokkien, right? Hokkien Minnan. So you speak fluently. When you arrive in Penang, you are like at home, right? Very happy because it's the same language, except that in Malay, Malaysian Hokkien, I thought someone from USA. Are you Hokkien? Okay, if you are from Penang, you listen to them, they speak Hokkien with a lot of Malay words in it. Right? They say sabun, they say, I don't know, but they say mata. In Indonesia, police is what? Polisi. Mata, what is it? Mata is spy, but in Malaysian, mata is police. Detective actually, in that sense, but it's used as mata. You see, mata. Right? So, in this sense, language would be very crucial. But if you were to study about the hybrid communities, then you are in trouble because they speak a different language altogether, right? Because it's a mix between Malay and Hokkien. I don't know what they're talking about. Any other questions? No?
Yeah,
Yes.
just a final one, sorry. You mentioned that pre-1850s migration present in Southeast Asia is often from certain regions, certain lineages, Chinatown or certain merchant families. But would you argue that Hakka is kind of Hakka migration is kind of exceptional because they're always their movements are always kind of from rural areas to rural areas. Before the 1850s and after 1850s, they're constantly moving. You know, they are not certainly all of them are merchants. A lot of them worked rural ground in mines as common laborers, and they, yes, would you think of that as kind of a continuation?
The Hakka, of which I studied a lot more, because that's my project all along, working on the Hakka, because from where I come from, Sabah, we are Hakka speakers, because 60% of the Chinese there are Hakka. And therefore we also said that even the birds there will speak Hakka. You know, certain birds do speak, right? Certain myna and also parrots. So they were taught Hakka, so of course they speak Hakka. So Hakka is actually exceptional because, like you say, they came from rural area, very rural. Like my mother is a Hakka, so when I went to her village, it's really in the case of Malay word, we say very ulu. You know the word ulu? It's like the up river, don't know where ulu, you know? And then we travel so many miles up, and suddenly you see a little valley, poor soil. I don't know how they survive. But the men, most of the men were mason. You know mason? People who work on stones. Many of them were miners. The Hakkas came out very early. Now that you mention, there was a group that came out to Banjarmasin, a group that went up to Singkawang in Dutch Borneo, 1730s. They were already there. Gold miners. And the Chinese always say that they've established a republic. The world's first republic was not the French Republic, right? Not the American Republic either. It's the Chinese Republic in Dutch Borneo. Right? So he established this colony of Hakka, and they were miners. And indeed, the Hakka mining technology was considered superior, and they were recruited. So if you go to San Francisco, you go to Australia, where you find gold mines and so on, many of them, not all of them, many of them were Hakkas. Because they have a way of digging, I don't know why. dig, right? And it's like the seven dwarfs of the Snow White. We dig, there's a song for it, right? So if you listen to that, you say, oh, Hakka miners, dig. And they dig their way even into Sarawak, when they were chased out by the Dutch authorities. They went into Sarawak. And later on, when the Hakka came out, you just can't imagine how far they have to travel from inland to get to the places where they actually went on board. It's very far. I don't know how they manage it. But today, I sat in a van, I traveled so far, and then arrived at that place. Those days you walk, you see. You really walk. So, yeah, this is a peculiar group. Their experience is very rich and very exciting to study because the group that I studied is the Hakka Christians. Remember, we were looking at some pictures of the Chinese experience. This one. This guy brought a group of Hakka, including my mother's family, to Sabah. A pastor from Switzerland, from the Basel Mission. The Basel Mission started working among the Hakka in 1847 in Guangdong, and they started to preach to them in Hakka languages, the Hakka dialect. They were linked to the Taiping Rebellion. The founder of Taiping Rebellion, Hong Xiuqian, was also a Hakka, and he received a pamphlet on Christianity that was published in Malacca, written by a man called Liang Fa or Liang Afa. Now, this story itself is already transnational, if you like. Right? And therefore, when the rebellion failed, the Hakka were persecuted by the Manchu government, and they have to go out. And Rudolf Leclerc, the pastor, actually helped them to go out as far as Hawaii. Many years ago, I was talking to a family in Sabah. They showed me a letter from Hawaii. They said this was written by one of the aunties in Hawaii. And it's actually written in Chinese, but Romanized Chinese. Hakka. I said, what's the connection? Well, the connection was that one of the groups that was sent out actually landed in Hawaii. So now we are trying to link up Hawaii, Peru, Lima, Cuba, British Guiana, Tahiti, Jamaica, Bermuda, Sabah, Sarawak as the whole belt of migration because of this thing. Is that not transnational? That's transnational. So we are working on this topic and I'm getting very excited. Just that I also face the same problem. Spanish. How to read Spanish? Cannot read. Right? Ole, that's the only one I know. Ole. So what do? You get help. Historians get a lot of help from different people, different group of people. If we can't understand something, we bring a guide, we get a translator. But of course, the best is to be able to learn the language and actually embrace that culture as well, right? So I think I better stop here, otherwise they're going to... Any boss?
Yes, we have to stop now.
Yes. So no more question, but you saw my email on the slide. If you want to drop me a message, I'm more than happy to reply to my best ability. Thank you so much.